Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 10th webinar in the Offshore Wind series, Learning from the Experts. I'm Cheryl Huber, Project Manager with NYSERDA's Offshore Wind team, and it is my pleasure to be joined by today's experts, Jess Stromberg and Michelle Morin with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who will be giving us a presentation on the Offshore Wind Construction and Operations Plan, or COP, review process. Before I introduce our speakers, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Firstly, if you're experiencing any technical issues, please contact Tricia King at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series will be available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speakers. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030 and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Experts speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshore-nyserda.ny.gov. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jess Stromberg and Michelle Morin. Jess has been working in the Office of Renewable Energy Programs, or OREP, at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management since 2009. She has extensive experience managing the leasing and development process for projects proposed offshore the New England coast. Starting in August 2021, Jessica will be participating in a 4-month detail as the acting chief of the Engineering and Technical Review Branch in OREP, where she will manage an interdisciplinary team responsible for reviewing submitted plans and reports to ensure construction and operation design parameters for any proposed facilities adhere to accepted engineering practices and industry standards. Also performing analyses for vessel navigation, metocean, geophysical, and geological informational needs, and providing input on areas for technology assessment and research. Michelle has been with BOEM for 26 years and has coordinated dozens of environmental impact statements and assessments for BOEM's oil and gas and renewable energy programs in headquarters and the Gulf of Mexico region. As the chief of BOEM's Environment Branch for Renewable Energy, she manages an interdisciplinary team responsible for environmental assessments, consultations, and studies related to renewable energy leasing and development on the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. Thank you, and I will now hand things over to Jess.
Thank you very much. So today I will be leading off this presentation with some brief background information about BOEM. I will briefly review the overall wind energy leasing process and go through what is required to be included in a construction and operations plan, or COP, and also talk about its review after it's submitted. And then I will turn it over to Michelle to talk about the path forward for reviewing COPs, including an overview of the environmental review and consultation process. Next slide, please. So for those who don't know, BOEM is an agency within the Department of the Interior, and the Renewable Energy Program, the Office of Renewable Energy Program's mission is to facilitate the responsible development of renewable energy on the Outer Continental Shelf through conscientious planning, stakeholder engagement, comprehensive environmental analysis, and through sound technical review. So BOEM oversees the development of renewable energy on the OCS, the Outer Continental Shelf, including wind, wave, and ocean current energy, and also the transmission of electricity generated by those resources. But the focus of today's presentation and what we are discussing is offshore wind energy construction and operations plan. Next slide, please. And this slide shows an overview of BOEM's offshore wind energy leasing and development process. This process occurs over 4 phases, which include planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, and construction and operations. This graphic on the slide shows some information about the major activities that occur in each phase and the timing associated with those phases. But as I mentioned, today we'll be focusing on the final phase of the program and the review of construction operations plans. If you click next, it should highlight the box there. Thank you. After the site assessment term begins, lessees will have 4.5 years to submit a COP to BOEM. And during that site assessment term, lessees are gathering information about their lease area, which means they're conducting site-specific surveys or installing site assessment facilities like meteorological towers or buoys that will allow them to collect information about their site and inform their future plans for development. These activities, the site characterization activities and site assessment activities, are also overseen by BOEM, and we review those activities through the submission of survey plans and then also the review of site assessment plans. And so as I'll discuss shortly, all of the information collected by the lessee is then included with the COP submission. Next slide, please. So what is a COP and what does it include? What must it demonstrate? The purpose of the COP is to provide a description of all of the proposed activities and planned facilities that the lessee intends to construct and use for their projects on their commercial lease area. This includes a description of all planned facilities, including onshore and supports facilities, as well as any project easement needs for the project. And by project easement, we mean the export cable, connecting the project to shore. The COP must also describe these activities related to their construction, commercial operations, maintenance, decommissioning, and site clearance procedures. All of that information has to be included in the COP. In addition to that, the COP has to demonstrate that the lessee has planned and is prepared to conduct those activities in a manner that ensures all of the things that you see on this slide here. Safety, not causing undue harm or damage to natural resources or the environment to the extent practicable, conforming with all applicable laws, implementing regulations, lease provisions, et cetera, utilizing best available and safest technology, utilizing best management practices, and then using properly trained personnel. Next slide, please. And so BOEM's regulations, which were finalized in April of 2009, really govern what must be submitted with the COP and within the COP. And those are found at 30 CFR 585, 626, and 627. And to facilitate BOEM's review of the COP, BOEM really recommends structuring your submission or the submission around these regulatory sections and identifying in a easy way how the information satisfies the requirements of each of those sections. And that facilitates BOEM's review, the public's review, other agencies' review, et cetera. So over the next few slides, I will describe the elements of what must be included within and submitted with the COP. But I just wanted to note that for more detailed information, BOEM does have guidelines that further explain these COP submission requirements. And this includes details about the project-specific information to include, answers questions like how to address phase development of a commercial lease in the COP submission. And it also includes recommendations or guidelines for survey information, data that needs to be included, as well as any other information that is needed for BOEM to complete its environmental reviews and consultations or comply with any other applicable laws and regulations. Next slide, please. So the COP, the first elements that have to be addressed in the COP are articulated in 585-626. And those include, as I mentioned, the results of surveys. And those surveys include shallow hazard surveys, geological surveys, geotechnical, archaeological, and biological surveys, as well as an overall site investigation report that integrates the findings of those shallow hazards, geological, geotechnical, geophysical survey results. The project information that is required to be submitted is also listed on this slide, and I'll go through some of this. This is not all inclusive, so I encourage folks for a full list to look at the regulations and then also to review BOEM's COP guidelines. And then also just to note that a nomination for a certified verification agent is also required to be submitted with the COP, or a request for a waiver if the lessee wishes to use the project engineer instead. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the results of the survey data need to be submitted with the COP. And that includes not just the results themselves, but the data itself. The COP really needs to describe all of the resources, conditions, and activities that could be affected by the proposed activities, as well as the environmental conditions that could affect the activities proposed in the COP. So all of this information must be included with the COP. And then, as I mentioned earlier, an overall site investigation report that integrates that geophysical and geotechnical survey data also needs to be included. And if you go to the next slide, thank you. There's great news because we have guidelines for the information that is required to be submitted for each of these resource areas. So these are all available on our website. They range from submission of spatial data, providing avian information, providing geological, geophysical information, archaeological information, information about fisheries, benthic habitats, marine mammals, sea turtles. And then I think there's even maybe a couple more on our website, but all of that information is available. And we encourage the discussion of what information should be collected during that site assessment, site characterization phase, and then also included in the COP during pre-survey meetings with BOEM, and then also during regular meetings with BOEM, or during like a pre-submission meeting. Next slide, please. So in addition to all of that, all of the resource information, all of the survey information that needs to be included, there's also project information that needs to be included. And Michelle is going to talk a little bit about our draft project design envelope guidelines, which are also available on our website, and describe some information about how projects can be characterized. But from BOEM's regulatory perspective, these information requirements need to be addressed, and that's contact information, designation of operator information, and there's actually a form on BOEM's website for designation of an operator, the overall construction and operation concepts, so the objectives for the project, a description of the activities, the construction procedures, installation procedures, the layout, the project configuration, the electrical service platforms, transmission cables, shoreside infrastructure, and then also a tentative schedule for the whole project from start to completion. In addition to that, information about measures that the lessee is using to comply with their lease stipulations, as well as proposed measures for avoiding, minimizing, reducing, eliminating, and monitoring environmental impacts need to be addressed in the COP. In general, information about the structural and project design, fabrication, installation for each of the facilities needs to be included, including the cables and pipelines, as I mentioned earlier. And then any vessels, vehicles, aircraft that would need to be used, decommissioning, site clearance procedures, general concepts and methodologies also need to be addressed. And then other information that might be, that needs to be addressed include the navigation safety risk assessment, and then lighting and marking information, of course. And so these are if you look at the regulations, you look at our COP guidelines, these are the buckets of information needs that that need to be satisfied with the COP submission. And this is what BOEM is really reviewing for, in addition to the survey result information and data. Next slide, please. Okay, and then as I mentioned earlier, with the COP, there are additional items that need to be included, and those are articulated in 585-627. And those include information that BOEM needs to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, to conduct our environmental review and our consultations. Also, the lessee needs to include an oil spill response plan, a safety management system. And details about those information requirements, as I mentioned, are included in our COP guidelines as well. Next slide, please. So what does BOEM do when we receive a COP? When we receive a COP, we conduct an initial review. We make a determination whether the information that was provided satisfies the information required by our regulations first, and that's sort of our completeness determination. And then subsequent to that, we make a sufficiency determination. So is the information provided, is it of sufficient quality or in a sufficient quantity for us to be able to, for BOEM to be able to conduct its environmental review, go through its consultations, conduct a technical review, et cetera. And so we'll go through rounds of review of these plans before we get to a point where we initiate that environmental review process, which Michelle will talk about. And once we initiate that environmental review process, the COP is posted on our website, absent any kind of confidential business information. So it's very important when a lessee submits a COP that they label anything that's identified as confidential, accordingly, and that they make BOEM aware of that. And then we go through our technical and our environmental review process. At the culmination of that process, BOEM will reach a decision on the COP, and that can be to disapprove the COP or approve the COP as it was submitted, or through any kind of modifications that might have been submitted along the way, or approve the COP with modifications, and those would be articulated as terms and conditions of COP approval. And then post-approval, you're not done yet, there are engineering reports such as the facility design report, the fabrication and installation report, and the safety management system that have to be, the first two of which have to be submitted and reviewed by BOEM for any objections. And that review process is really to ensure that the information included is of acceptable engineering standards and practices, has been reviewed by a certified verification agent, is consistent with the approved construction and operations plan and any kind of terms and conditions, if that were the case. And then the safety management system has to be fully functional. And I will note that for some of the information requirements that I've talked about, we have heard about lessees wanting to provide information later in the process, such as in situ technical information at each foundation location with the facility design report or fabrication and installation report. And BOEM will facilitate the review of those requests through its departure process, and that's articulated in 30 CFR 585-103. And the decisions that BOEM has made about those regulatory departures are posted on BOEM's website. So if you have any questions about that, I would look to BOEM's website first, and then contact us, of course, and discuss them at pre-submission meetings with BOEM. Next slide, please. And right after this, I'll turn it over to Michelle, but this is just an overview of the Atlantic projects that for which we have received COPs from north to south, with the exception of, I believe, Beacon Wind and Liberty Wind. And then, of course, Vineyard Wind 1, that project, we did process a COP for, it has been approved. So that is available on our website, as well as the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project. That was a research project, but it was an offshore wind project, and that was installed, and that, of course, is also on our website. So not all of these projects have initiated that environmental review process yet. And so not all of this information, the COPs, for these projects are included on our website yet, but this just gives you an idea of our current workload, our upcoming workload, and then which Michelle will talk about now. So thank you. Michelle, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. Yeah, if you could advance to the next slide. So with all these projects in the pipeline, we're always asked, well, what's the path forward for construction and operation plan or COP reviews? So if you go back to March 2021, the White House announced BOEM's goal of advancing new lease sales, but also completing the review of at least 16 of these construction and operation plans by 2025. And how we view completion of our reviews is reaching records of decisions. And I'll get more into what a record of decision is. So since late 2017, BOEM has received 14 construction and operation plans. And we anticipate 4 additional COPs over the next 12 months. That number is always growing. So next presentation, you may see Jess and I on, that number may be larger. If you can move to the next slide. So each construction operation plan will require consideration of the potential impacts under what we call an environmental impact statement, or EIS. And that's prepared under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So in May 2021, we completed an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, for the Vineyard Wind 1 project, and completion of that EIS was marked with a joint record of decision, or also known as a ROD. And we anticipate another record of decision, or ROD, being issued in just a couple months in October for the South Fork wind farm. And in 2021, we began the EIS process for 6 additional construction and operation plans, with the most recent and ongoing comment period right now is for the Kitty Hawk project offshore North Carolina. And it is very likely that we'll issue or begin the EIS process for 3 more COPs before the end of this year. And I'll walk through the schedule for an EIS, but the process, once we begin, usually takes about 2 years. Next slide, please. So what is an environmental impact statement, or EIS? As I explained, this is prepared under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And this is the most comprehensive or detailed analysis that can be done under NEPA. And there's 2 main parts or goals of an environmental impact statement or other reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act. One is to involve the public, and the other is to inform the decision. So in an environmental impact statement, we begin with the proposed action, and that's what is proposed by the lessee in its construction and operation plan. That forms our proposed action. But we're also required under NEPA to look at a reasonable range of alternatives with the goal of reducing or eliminating impacts from the proposal. And those are framed by what we call a purpose and need statement, basically the purpose and need of the action. And in this case, BOEM's action is under the proposed action, approval of the COP as is. So for a reasonable range of alternatives, there's what we call action alternatives that could slightly modify or greatly modify the proposed action. Those could be seasonal or geographic restrictions, again, with the goal of reducing or eliminating impacts. And they must be reasonable, so economically and technically feasible, and meet the purpose and need of the proposed action. We're also required under NEPA to look at a no action alternative, and that's basically the disapproval of the project. It was one of the 3 options that Jess went over earlier in the presentation. So for the proposed action, each of the action alternatives, and the no action, we look at the effects. What are the reasonably foreseeable environmental effects that could happen as a result of selecting any of those alternatives? So to put that in context, we start with the affected environment. What's the baseline conditions for all these environmental resources that we'll be examining? And then we look at what are the reasonably foreseeable trends, and also what are the impacts from other actions that could be occurring in the future through the life of this proposed action. And that could be other offshore wind facilities as well. So the effects that we analyze and disclose could be beneficial or adverse, and sometimes for individual resources, they could be both, a combination of both beneficial and adverse. So for each environmental resource, and I'll go through a list in a minute, we look at each phase of the proposed project. So construction, then operation and maintenance, and then finally decommissioning. And then we break each of those phases down a little further, and we look at what we call impact producing factors. What are the elements occurring at that time, each of those phases that could affect the resources. So we have impact levels we define in every environmental impact statement, where we categorize the impacts as either negligible, minor, moderate, or major. And we kind of designate those by impact producing factor. And then at the end, we consider that as a whole. What's the overall impact of that alternative on that resource? And then we do compare across alternatives, again, to inform the decision maker. Can you go to the next slide? And as promised, here's a list of the environmental resources we typically consider in our environmental impact statements: biological, physical, and socioeconomic resources. And I'll talk about it in a few slides, how we solicit input from the public on what are the issues and resources we consider. So we can dive a little further in that into scoping where it may be particular elements, say, affecting marine mammals, than rather the broad question, should we look at marine mammals? So yes, of course, but what are the issues concerning marine mammals that we need to dive into in the environmental impact statement? Can you go to the next slide? So there are a number of agencies involved in offshore wind. These are just the federal agencies. We also have states and tribes that are cooperating. We call cooperating agencies under NEPA. But for the federal agencies, these can range from agencies besides BOEM that have authorizations. There are mandated consultations, such as the Endangered Species Act, where we have to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. There are also agencies that don't have authorization and don't have a mandated consultation, but we still coordinate with them, such as the Department of Defense. And some of these agencies have multiple roles in the process. And for some agencies, like the FAA, it does depend on the location of the project. So for example, FAA's jurisdiction only extends out 12 nautical miles. So it will depend exactly what's being proposed and where. If you can continue to the next slide. Thank you. Because there's so many agencies involved, there really is the need to have one government approach, really enhance the coordination between the agencies. You don't want, 5 different environmental impact statements. You want to be efficient about it and look at everything together. So that's where what we call FAST 41 or Title 41 of Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act comes in. This is actually optional for the applicant, but most of our lessees that have submitted COPs, plan to submit COPs, are going this route. And basically they request to the Department of Interior that their project be deemed covered under FAST 41. And generally, if a construction operation plan is submitted, BOEM the Department of Interior will deem that project covered. And some of the key aspects of FAST-41 or the FAST-41 process is that the agencies, the cooperating agencies, do develop the permitting timetable together. We get concurrence before we even start the process. And this timetable is the major milestones for the EIS, for all the consultations, and also all the authorizations that would be necessary from the different agencies for the project to actually move forward. And agencies have different roles. BOEM is the lead agency, and then we have cooperating and participating agencies. And that really depends on whether or not they have an authorization role or not. And FAST-41 also gives us some oversight and dispute resolution mechanisms in the event that agencies are not in agreement with a particular aspect or moving forward. And all of this is very public. There's a permitting dashboard. So if you actually Google permitting dashboard, you can find it, and you can look up the individual offshore wind projects. And those timelines, that permitting timetable that I mentioned, are available. So if you want to know more about FAST-41, I did include the link here. If you can continue to the next slide. So as promised, here is the EIS process. The first column, COP submittal, Jess did a good job going through that, but I'll just maybe recap it just a little bit. This is pre-environmental review. We're looking to see, is all the information submitted? Is it sufficient for us to conduct our environmental review and consultations? So we don't necessarily have to have all the information in-house before we begin the environmental review, but we look for two things. One is, do we have enough information for the public to make meaningful scoping comments, give us meaningful input on what the scope, the issues and alternatives we should consider in the EIS will be. And the second thing we look for is, once we do issue the notice of intent to begin the environmental review process, it starts a clock for us, which I'll go through that time frame, but that 2 years to reach a record of decision. So information that's coming in later, we want to make sure that's not going to make it difficult for us to complete our review. It's also during this time that we're working with the agencies to develop that permitting timetable, but also develop what we call a purpose and needs statement, which I mentioned earlier, which frames what the alternatives we'll consider. And it's really, what's the objective of the project? So once we feel like we do have enough information to go forward, if you can look at the second column, and I've in red are areas that signify public involvement and notification. Again, that's one of the other primary purposes of reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act is public involvement. So those are in red. So we issue the first of our Federal Register notices, and that's a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement. And it initiates a 30-day public comment period. Again, this is when we're looking for input on the scope of our EIS, issues, alternatives, mitigation measures. During that time period, we'll hold public meetings. For the past year and a half, we've held those virtually, and I think we have a really good format and we're getting good attendance. I think we've held 24 NEPA public meetings in the past year and a half related to offshore wind activities. So after the end of the scoping period, we'll regroup with the cooperating agencies, go through the comments we've received, and as a group, we'll decide on which alternatives we should consider and detail in this environmental impact statement. Any alternatives that were identified that there are reasons for not considering forward, we would also provide that justification in the environmental impact statement. So with the agencies, we also, after we identify alternatives, we analyze those alternatives, and the agencies do provide input and review of that environmental impact statement. And at this stage, it's a draft environmental impact statement or draft EIS. It's approximately 1 year after the notice of intent, we will publish a draft environmental impact statement. And this is where you have your second Federal Register notice of the process. In this case, it's a notice of availability beginning a 45-day public comment period, during which we have a second set of public meetings. And this is to get input on the draft EIS. How good of a job did BOEM do? Do we need any corrections? Are we missing any key information? We take those comments, go back with the cooperating agencies and basically update the EIS. We make any necessary corrections, any additions, and then if there are no changes based on a comment, we have to justify why that was the case. So we publish once we do that, we publish a final environmental impact statement, and this is your third Federal Register notice notification to the public of the availability of the final EIS. That starts what we call a 30-day wait period. It's not a public comment period, but it's a 30 days. An agency cannot make any decisions within 30 days after a final environmental impact statement. We have to wait at least 30 days. In reality, it takes a little longer than 30 days. There's a process to approve and clear, and in this case for offshore wind, these are actually joint records of decisions. They, if you look at Vineyard Wind 1 as an example, it was signed by BOEM, the national, by NIMS, the Army Corps, for their own permits. And we do publish our final notice of availability for the record of decision in the Federal Register. And then only after that's done, we could then, if approved, issue that approval. So the record of decision will lay out BOEM's decision whether the project was approved with conditions or modifications, or a disapproval of the COP. And when I say modifications or conditions, these are normally mitigation measures. And I should probably also explain that the COP could include, I think Jess covered this, measures that the developer is voluntarily undertaking to reduce the impacts of its project. And those are considered part of the proposed action. Those are things that are laid out in the COP and committed to by the developer. But through our EIS and consultations, we can identify additional mitigation measures. And any of those adopted would be conditions of approval. Can you continue to the next slide? So concurrent with our EIS, and in some cases our EIS sections actually kind of double for consultation documents, but concurrent with the EIS process, we conduct a number of mandated consultations. And so I have most of them listed here. All of them ideally are completed before the final EIS, but must be completed before our record of decision. If you can continue to the next slide. So Jess mentioned this earlier, design envelopes. Basically what this means is that a developer can propose their project with a reasonable range of design parameters. For example, they may not have narrowed down their foundations. So it could be a gravity-based foundation and a monopile foundation in their construction operation plan. It could be multiple potential landfall locations or turbine sizes. And so what we do in the environmental impact statement is focus our analysis on the most impactful producing parameters or combination of parameters for that particular resource. So it does change by resource. So I'll give you an example. Say we have a construction and operation plan that proposes either gravity-based foundations or monopile foundations. And that EIS for marine mammals will focus our analysis on monopiles because that's more impactful because of the noise that would be generated. Where that same EIS for benthic habitat would focus on the gravity-based because of the greater footprint. And then we do address how would that change if other elements of the envelope were implemented. We did issue draft guidance on the use of design envelopes, which is very commonplace in Europe. And so our guidance was really influenced by the United Kingdom's Rochdale envelope approach. So we've learned a lot of lessons in the 2.5 years that our draft guidance has been out. So we are looking to revise that guidance and give some more clarity to the lessees and incorporate our lessons learned. So just be on the lookout for that probably later in the year, early next year. Can you go to the next slide? So I get a lot of questions about, hey, this is a lot of work. How is BOEM tackling all this? So we have a number of different resources and ways we're doing that. For each construction and operation plan, we have what we call a third-party EIS contractor to support BOEM. So what a third-party EIS contractor is, it's an environmental contractor that is paid by the lessee, but is actually selected and directed by BOEM. And this is a very, very common practice with federal agencies. So there is a strict firewall between the lessee and the contractor. So a lot of the EIS preparation and consultation work is done by the contractor, but they are directed again, but also independently, their work reviewed by BOEM and cooperating agencies. Then we do have contracting through federal procurement. So there's a lot of like cross-project work that we do. So a lot of white papers or studies will be done that way, or support contracts. And we are in the process, we've already hired several people in the process of bringing more staff on board. And finally, we are redirecting staff resources from other BOEM program areas to support offshore wind reviews and activities. And next slide. So I definitely want to mention our environmental studies program. It's really key to our environmental assessment program. Through our environmental assessments, we identify data needs, which we fulfill through our environmental studies program, and the output of that is then fed into future environmental assessments. There's an annual cycle to our studies program, and in fall and early winter, you usually see a request or invitation to stakeholders to give us your thought and feedback on what should we be studying the next fiscal year. So that's really valuable. So I have the link to our renewable energy portion of the environmental studies program. So I really encourage you to go there, and it's a good place to also be aware of when that invitation to stakeholders goes out. And maybe another kind of pitch to look at is the Rodeo project. It's about capturing real-time observations of offshore wind development. And it's been going on several years now. We made a lot of observations at the Block Island Wind Facility, and we did the same thing on the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project. And we hope to continue this as projects are constructed to, again, feed into those future environmental assessments. And I think that's my last slide, if you want to go on to the next. And I think it's time for questions. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, both Jess and Michelle, for all of that information. Certainly a lot of regulatory information and process information in a nice, succinct visual format. So that is, I'm sure, really appreciated by many folks who are listening. Before I get into Q&A, I would like to remind listeners to submit your questions via the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function, as we don't want to miss anything in case something gets lost in that shuffle. So again, please now submit your questions to the presenters via the Q&A function. I have a few questions that did come in, and so I'm going to start off. Not sure who wants to take this one, but how has BOEM's thinking in COP review evolved over the past year, given the federal administration's ambitious goals and the increase or the goals for a total gigawatt goal by 2030?
Yeah, I can take that first, Jess, and then if you want to add anything. For me personally, this is a lot of environmental impact statements being prepared at the same time, but also being published at the same time. So, so two things. One, consistency between documents where they should be consistent. And the other is, this is a lot of work. So how can we be efficient? So those two things together, we're really tackling how to identify and work on upfront portions or sections that should be common across project reviews. So we have some efforts going on with other agencies to work on standardizing the EIS process, but also the content. That way it frees up the agencies, but also the public to really focus on the unique aspects of each project. And I think also with scheduling, that we are considering not just the work for the agencies, but the burden on stakeholders. So kind of lining up those schedules. There is some spacing, but also moving forward quickly and efficiently.
Great. Thank you for that. I have another question here. I believe this one will also be for Michelle regarding the EIS. Since offshore wind projects are taken on to reduce the carbon footprint, how does that factor into the equation in the EIS?
No, good question. And we're always expanding that part based on comments. We do get those comments and we do go out with, say, draft EISs. So we do, like I said, we look at the beneficial impacts as well, not just adverse impacts. So that is considered. I would say for an individual project, you will see less of those benefits where it really comes into what was formerly known as cumulative analysis. So it's when we consider all the offshore wind projects that are being proposed under, I guess what's replaced cumulative as planned actions. So it's addressed in multiple places in our environmental impact statements, but primarily you'll see the biggest kind of impact under that planned action review.
Thank you. This is a two-part question. Since offshore wind projects are taken on, I'm sorry, I just read that one. Who pays for BOEM reviews of the COP is the first part. And the second is, does BOEM take the lead and become the sponsor for the EIS?
No, good questions. So, and if you look at our previous EISs, you'll see it was a requirement to actually report the cost of the EIS. So the bulk of the cost of the preparation of the EIS is paid directly to the contractor by the lessee through the third-party EIS contracting process. Again, there is a firewall and BOEM is the one directing and selecting the contractor. And then under our regulations, we are allowed to charge the lessee for our time directing the third-party EIS contractor and reviewing any deliverables from the contractor. So that's called a unique processing cost. So basically the developer, once we finish the EIS process, will get a bill for that BOEM time to prepare the EIS. And then finally, I guess the second part of the question was that at the end of the day, it's BOEM's EIS. We're the lead agency, and we have to independently review and accept that EIS. So we get assistance, but at the end of the day, it is ours. We are responsible for it.
Great. Okay. Next question is a little bit specific, but I think it's a good one. Is there guidance available for the expected timeline for the financial assurance required by BOEM for the SAP and COP phases? And there's a second part to that, specifically when the operator is released from each of these bonds. It's a pretty specific financial question. I'm not sure if that's your area of expertise, but if you have any information there, that would be great.
I can try to answer it. So there are supplemental bonding requirements outlined in BOEM's regulations, and those are found in I believe, subpart E of the regulations, the 585 500s. And my understanding is that BOEM makes a determination of what the government's cost to decommission the facilities described in the site assessment plan and the construction operations plan. We make that determination prior to installation of those facilities. If those plans are approved, communicate that to the lessee, and then the lessee has to provide them prior to installation of those facilities. And then the question about when the operator is released from the bonds, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's addressed in our regulations. So I can get an answer for that and follow up afterwards.
Thanks, appreciate that. Okay, next question. Does the Rodeo project have available public data sets for analysts who would be interested in creating additional visualizations and analytics?
Yeah, thank you. We do have a public webpage just for the Rodeo project with all the reports. I don't think the data is on our website, but I would encourage individuals, so if you want to follow up with me, my email address is here, and I can put you in touch with our science coordinator, Mary Boatman, to talk about getting you that information.
That's great. And yes, I'll point out to everybody that the email addresses of our presenters are here at the bottom of the slide. So appreciate you that offer, Michelle. Related to the environmental studies program, you just mentioned Mary Boatman. What types of projects are currently being conducted by the environmental studies program to address offshore wind federal permitting, or maybe to ease the federal permitting to help facilitate that?
Yeah, thank you. I probably won't try to attempt to list everything because I will probably miss some, but I always categorize them into two buckets. One is collecting more baseline information. We have collected a lot, and the lessees can use that data as well. But then there's also analyzing impacts to offshore wind. So some of it's actual observation as facilities are being constructed. So it focuses on pretty much every topic you would consider in an EIS. And so I talked about the cycle earlier. I had that diagram with the kind of assessment feeding into studies and studies of feeding into assessment. So Jess and I are both from the Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and the same individuals that are working on environmental assessments are also those proposing and managing our studies. So they have kind of that direct hands-on knowledge to feed into each part. Also in the presentation, I provided a link to our environmental studies program webpage, and we have what we call a year in review, Atlantic Science Year in Review. So if you want just a short recap of each study that's a report that's issued each year, that you can find that there as well. I think maybe just one other thing. One thing we're also focusing on, just trying to get more efficient and take advantage of kind of commonality across projects, is the preparation of white papers that can be reused. So we've done some on EMF and foundation types, but we've also done a lot on what we call cumulative, and we just issued one for the South Atlantic. And if you remember a few years ago, we did one for the North Atlantic, focused on cumulative for offshore wind. And that was really the basis for our analysis in the Vineyard Wind supplemental EIS.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a few questions here related to understanding the finding of impacts, as well as how you establish what an alternative is. And so I know that relates back to the one and only precedent that we've, or process that we've gone through with the first COP and ROD that we've gotten. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that. Maybe how can you, or how do how do you set an impact level for an alternative in the EIS? What types of analysis will go into determining that impact level? Because then I think that will inform some of the information on actual impacts that you are finding or don't find, that you're analyzing.
Yeah, thank you. So we do work, and this is similarity across environmental impact statements. We do work on definitions of the impacts levels. Like, again, I said negligible, minor, moderate, and major. And so we define what does that mean for each resource. So you have those definitions up front. You don't want to create these definitions after the fact. You start up front, you do your analysis, and then you compare them to the definitions. So you have that consistent description of impact levels. So we do look across impact producing factors for each resource, where noise, it could be this level, but presence of a structure could be this level. And then in the conclusion, we put all that together. So combined, what is the impact level? And for all of that, we do go back to our definitions. That is done for each resource, for each alternative. And the other job of the EIS is to let the decision maker know or compare across alternatives to see if there's a benefit of one alternative versus the other. So that's another area that we do work with cooperating agencies. We want to be on the same page on definitions of impact levels up front. And I think maybe part of the other part of the question is, how do you determine what are the alternatives? So we have developed what we call screening criteria, that kind of a checklist to go through, what it needs to meet to be considered an alternative, or an alternative that we analyze in detail. And that is also described in environmental impact statement.
Thank you for that. We have a number of questions that have come in, and unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to them all. But I did want to put out one other question. We haven't really talked about decommissioning very much. And there was a question in here, is there an overall or general desire of BOEM how a developer should decommission, or maybe how that is addressed in the COP itself? Since we haven't done any actual decommissioning in the United States so far, I'm just wondering, how that is dealt with now in the initial phases.
Yeah, so in the COP itself, we require a general concept and a description of the general methodologies for decommissioning. The decommissioning obligations are articulated in BOEM's regulations in subpart I, and that includes, removal of all facilities, projects, cables, pipelines, obstructions, clearing the seafloor, and then actually after the decommissioning is completed, submitting verification to BOEM of that. And all of that is included in an application, what we call a decommissioning application, which is submitted to BOEM, 2 years before the expiration of the lease. And then we would review that and issue a determination on that at that time. So either approve or approve with modifications or disapprove. But at the COP stage, it's just a general concept of the methodologies.
Oh, terrific. So that's all we have time for today. I'm going to thank both Jess and Michelle very, very much for joining us today. And thank everyone else for joining us in this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that the webinar recording and presentation slides will be available at nyserda.ny.gov /OSW-webinar-series. So that's nyserda.ny.gov /OSW-webinar-series. Our next webinar in the series is on September 1st. Drew Carey with Inspire Environmental will discuss the relative impacts of fixed offshore wind foundation types in the ocean environment. You can register for this and future webinars through our events page at wind.ny.gov. If you have requests for future topics or would like to hear about more about this in the series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.